Greetings and welcome to this lecture series in United States history. I'm Daniel Lazar. Thank you for joining me here. Today's talk is going to be about immigration, urbanization, social reform, and political machines in the Gilded Age. It's going to be a long one. I'm going to stitch together a couple of independent lectures to try to give to you a nuanced, robust, and broad overview of Gilded Age America. We begin with this title slide where Rockefeller, in Rockefeller's hand, he's holding the White House, and it's like a funny little thing it is, right? And DC is steeped in oil, and we have oil flying out of the Capitol building, which is to say, during this era of the Gilded Age, the criticism, which was hardly invalid, was that big business controlled politics in Washington and throughout the country. I want to just sort of set the stage and situate the time frame. If we talk about the 40 years prior to the United States Civil War as the antebellum era, or perhaps in addition to that, the Manifest Destiny era, and then we have the Civil War, following which we have Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, which is defined by the growth of industry, massive immigration, rapid urbanization, and endemic political corruption, takes place roughly from 1870 to 1900, right? Industry and immigration and urbanization happened before this and it happened after, but there is this generation, this 30-year window where these processes were catalyzed. And then in the first 20 years of the 20th century, the progressive era, which we will get into soon enough, aimed to resolve some of the ills that massive industrialization, immigration, and urbanization created. All right. So that's just sort of a chronological context for understanding the Gilded Age. This lecture is going to begin with talking about immigration and then the reformist reactions to immigration. That's the first part of the talk. And then the second part is where the immigrants went to, which is to say urbanization and the shameful state of American cities. And then lastly, how political machines sought to provide comfort to immigrants, but also doing so in the most corrupt possible way, capitalizing, if you will, on the opportunities that immigrants provided them to achieve unfettered power. So that's sort of our path, focusing first on immigration and reactions to it. We're going to explore a number of themes in this lecture. I want to just sort of foreshadow some of the most, I think, interesting themes that I'm going to dive into here. The first is the immigration dilemma. Yeah, immigration has been a source of divisiveness in America, but also a source of ending opportunities in America since its inception. And we'll talk about some of the complexities of the immigration dilemma during the Gilded Age, 1870 to 1900. We will also talk about how and why the American dream evolved in this era, a dream that was for, generations, really the Jeffersonian dream of having a plot of land and freedom from others, freedom from government. And then that American dream in this era became about wealth. It wasn't about being land rich, it was being about cash rich. Yeah. And we'll talk about how and why that dream evolved and some of the benefits and dysfunctions of that particular incarnation of the American dream. Another theme that comes up in this lecture is social movements and how social movements, including but not limited to religious movements, help to reframe and recast the debates in American political culture, and how social movements, despite, as always, being flawed, how social movements, in oh so many ways, made America a better place, a more welcoming place, a more just and kind and verdant place. Yeah. And that was necessary. These movements were necessary because in this period that I'm roughly calling the Gilded Age, America rapidly transitioned from a nation of producers, farmers, to a nation of consumers, urbanites. And this rapid industrial transition and the accompanying urbanization process was, shall we say, a mixed blessing. It was progress, but it was not progress without pain. And of course, the pain of progress was felt most acutely by people of color and by women. And we'll talk about that theme as we so often do. And last, we will talk about uh, the crises and opportunities that great changes in American history provide, and in this case, in the case of the political machine, which rose to capitalize on the influx of immigrants and the massive influxes of capital into the United States. And as always, we will be thinking about, how all of these processes are perhaps best viewed through the lens of cause and effect, but also change over time. Yeah. So these are some of the key themes that I hope to explore in this talk. Let's talk about the etymology of the term the Gilded Age. It was actually a term conceived by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley in a novel called The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. It's a satirical novel, and those of you who know Mark Twain know that satire was his bailiwick. And Twain and Dudley are kind of poking fun at the explicit and expressed political corruption in post-Civil War America. It was so conspicuous, the corruption, that it was so easy to poke fun at. And there is just a passage in the book where uh, Twain and Dudley say, and I'm quoting here, the golden gleam of the gilded surface hides the cheapness of the metal underneath. So something that is gilded, like if you could imagine a statue that is, painted gold, but beyond that gold is just, stone or granite, bronze. It's a gilded statue, right? A gold plated necklace is a gilded necklace. And so the metaphor, of course, if you're just waking up here, is that while America on the outside was shiny and brilliant, it was, in fact, a really sort of cheap and chintzy structure that was maintaining that glimmering exterior. Yeah. And these two images go some way to illustrating that. On the left, we have, these opalescent, gleaming capitalist excesses. This is the Vanderbilt mansion, right? Like, I don't know, what are those, like mahogany floors and, gold flecked ceilings, total capitalist excess. Gorgeous, and, there's a couple ways you could look at that photo, right? You can look at it with just, sort of neutral interest. It is sort of an interesting setup. You could look at it with envy. I mean, who among us wouldn't want to have that level of excess? Or you could look at it with scorn, right? All of that wealth could have been used to help this kid on the right. This is like a teenage coal miner, and Vanderbilt's wealth and Rockefeller's wealth and Heinz's wealth were all built on the backs of the exploited and oppressed working classes. Yeah. So when we're talking about the Gilded Age, we talk about three important processes: industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. And the three complement each other. Yeah. And we've already talked about in this class, industrialization. Today, we're going to talk about immigration, urbanization, and reactions to both. Let's talk about immigration first. There she is, Lady Liberty, right? Give us you're tired, you're poor, you're hungry, yearning to breathe free. That poem, that promise by Emma Lazarus, no relation, the socialist Emma Lazarus, uh, a source of hope and the beacon of freedom throughout the world, perhaps until recently. Let's talk about immigration to America. Now, I am going to give you, in fact, perhaps even flood you with numbers. I just urge you to take in these numbers to the best of your ability, not to memorize them, but to give you a sense of the contours of American immigration and really uh, the insanity of it, right? Like you will be astounded by the numbers. So between 1870 and 1900, the United States population doubled, right? I mean, that's in and of itself astounding. We're talking about a doubling of the American population. New York City became the most populous city in the world, second only to London. And you had a new type of immigrant. I say type sort of reluctantly. You have new nationalities and ethno-religious groups coming into America from Southern and Eastern Europe. Between 1851 and 1883, 300,000 Chinese arrived. By 1920, 200,000 Japanese had arrived. Both were mostly stationed on the West Coast. And on the East Coast, most notably in New York, you had 250,000 Caribbean people coming from 1880 to 1920. So you have a flood of people coming from places other than Northwest Europe. And let's dive into some of that. But before we do, there's this interesting table that I want to share with you. So after America won what some call her second war of independence, right? The War of 1812, which solidified America's independence from Britain. The mathematician Elkanah Watson was really concerned that America was going to become overpopulated. Yeah. He was looking at the trends and he was doing mathematical calculations, and he thought there's no way that if things kept going as they were, that the United States would be able to like hold the number of people that were likely to come. And he had predicted that by 1900 there would be 100,000 Americans uh, in America by 1900. Now he was off by 25 million, so it's a pretty substantial error that Watson made. And he was trying to issue a Jeremiah. He was trying to say, we have to stop immigration because there's no way we could hold all these people. But it is astounding when you look on the left-hand column of the American population, and every 10 years, it just goes up, 8 or 10 million people. And then from 1890 to 1900, it goes up by 13 million people. And the number of immigrants by decade, as we see on the right-hand column, it goes up, with one exception, substantially every decade. And so what we see here, first and foremost, is that America is irrefutably, and I hope proudly, although not everyone sees it this way, a nation of immigrants, a nation for and by immigrants. Yeah. But we also see that as early as 1815, Elkanah Watson and many, many others like him were concerned about immigration. Okay. So let's see more data. Again, take in as much of these numbers as you can. This is immigration to the United States decade by decade from 1821 to 2001. And I want to focus your attention on sort of the middle of this bar graph. Between 1871 and 1880, so the decade of the 1870s, we have 2.8 million people coming to America. The next decade, that almost doubles. It goes down a bit in the 1890s because of the so-called Great Depression, the 1893 Depression, which lasted much of that decade. But then coming out of that, we have this astounding boom in immigrants, 9 million people in the aughts. Yeah. 6 million people in the 1910s, another 4 million in the 1920s. These are astounding numbers of immigrants. Yeah. And it's going to have an impact. It's going to have an astounding impact. And we're going to have to look at what that impact was and thus what the reactions of it were. Yeah. Now, I want to dive in here just a moment to the immigration patterns to America in the decades leading up to the Civil War. And what we see in this graph is that throughout the 1840s and 50s, the overwhelming majority of people coming to America were either English, German, or Irish. And if you combine those three, say in 1840, you have 10 and 35 and 47. That's 92% of the immigrants coming to America were from one of those three European countries. And 20 years later, 67, you have 86% of the people coming to America are from Northwest Europe, Anglo-Saxon people, Germans, English, and Irish. And so, though you do have some diversity, it's mostly Northern European, Northwestern European people coming to the United States. Yeah. And we're going to see that change after the Civil War. And then that change seems to challenge American identities. Okay. Here is a table of immigration from Europe and Turkey by country in 3 years, 1882, 1902, and 1905. I don't know why it says 1906. Let's look at 1882. In 1882, you had 647,000 people come to the United States. 563,000 of them were from Western Europe, and 84,000 were from Southern and Eastern Europe and Turkey. So 87% of the people who came to America in 1882 were Western European. 13% were Southern and Eastern European. Fast forward 23 years, about a generation, and it almost flips entirely. In 1905, 22% of immigrants were coming from Western Europe, and 79% were coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the composition of immigrants to the United States changes. It changes substantially. And I regret to report that to a lot of Western European immigrants and to a lot of Americans from Western European origins, it didn't change for the better. Yeah. And we'll get into that. So you could spend as much time with this table as you want. It is indeed fascinating. But I'm going to move on from it. And I'm going to move on to talk about why it is that people came. Anytime we're talking about immigration, we talk about push factors, like forces that pushed people out of their home countries. And we talk about pull factors, the things about their country of destination that allured them. The push factors for Europeans were the Irish potato famine, remarkably tumultuous, the revolutions of the 1840s, the turning point on which history failed to turn. And the 1848 revolutions undermined stability in the German-speaking states, in Austria, Hungary, in France. We have deposed leaders, and it's quite a kerfuffle, to say the very least. So we have starvation in Ireland, we have political unrest, and we have religious persecution in Europe of Jews and of Catholics. Yeah, the Jews were driven out of Russia by the pogroms, and Bismarck made it part of his policy to persecute Catholics and to persecute socialists. I should say, not just religious persecution, but ideological persecution. I'm not quite sure how I left that off of the PowerPoint, because ideological persecution was, I'm going to say, as powerful as religious persecution during this era. Yeah. And then another push factor is that Europe was just, populating. The population of Europe doubled in the century, and people were looking for an escape hatch. A lot of Chinese were likewise looking for an escape hatch. The Opium Wars with Britain were really tumultuous. The Taiping Rebellion was tumultuous. This tumult led to an agricultural crisis and a food shortage, in particular a rice shortage. So the Chinese were looking for a place to be free, to be safe, and to be fed. Yeah, and that's what pushed them out. And the Mexican population also trying to get out of Mexico. As we've learned in this class, Mexico sort of careened from crisis to crisis after it achieved independence from Spain. Yeah. Perhaps the biggest crisis of the 19th century was the Mexican-American War. Mexico never quite recovered from that. And in 1910, Mexico had really, the first modern revolution, which led to great gains for Mexican people, but which led to a lot of political turmoil in the process. And so Mexicans came because of the political turmoil in Mexico, and they came, to be honest, because they could. The U.S. border with Mexico was effectively unguarded. Yeah, so it was really easy to take advantage of that escape hatch. So those are push factors. Here are some pull factors. We'll begin with de jure encouragement, right? So remember, de facto versus de jure, and de jure is by law. We have a series of laws that were passed, some of which were designed to satisfy the economic needs of the industrial capitalist machine in America. In 1864, at the height of the Civil War, when Sherman's troops were, marching to the sea and tearing up everything in their path, the Lincoln administration passed the Immigration Act, which exempted immigrants from compulsory military service, basically saying, we want more people to come here. We're going to need a lot of help rebuilding the economy after the war. You don't have to join the military if you come to the United States. Please come. 4 years later, in the Burlingame Treaty, the US and China agreed to allow unrestricted immigration from China so that Chinese people could work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Yeah. The US was going to gain a labor force to build the railroad, and China was going to, if it all worked out the way the Secretary of State had hoped, China was going to gain access to American industrial goods. So it was mutually beneficial. And by 1870, the Chinese were 10% of the population of California. And then the Chinese quickly became hated, vehemently so, as you will see in this talk. And so the railroad companies began to recruit in Mexico to replace the Chinese or to compete with Chinese laborers, driving wages down. Fast forward 30 plus years, in 1901, you have the National Reclamation Act, which was designed to create an irrigation system for the newly established farmland in the western states. And by western states here, I'm talking about like west of Iowa. All right. So now, we have this continued path, continuity here of Americans going further and further west, populating the country in this internal migration, which was made possible by external migration, people coming from other countries. And then also encouraging immigrants were Hawaiian planters who were recruiting Japanese people to come and to tend to Hawaiian land. And then when Hawaii was annexed in 1898, those Japanese people who are working hard in Hawaii came to the west coast of the United States, mostly in California. And they worked hard there, set up lives. So you had laws that encouraged immigrants to come. Yeah. You also have businesses which supported immigration. John Commons, who was a professor at the University of Wisconsin, distinguished in his time, very much a progressive professor at a progressive institution, which was cultivated by the progressive governor fighting Bob La Follette. He really puts his finger on how business supported immigration. And it's hard to listen to him talk this way, but here it goes. Quote, "It is an easy and patriotic matter for the lawyer, minister, professor, employer, or investor placed above the arena of competition to proclaim the equal right of all races to American opportunities. To avow his own willingness to give way should even be a better Chinaman, Hindu, or a Turk come in to take his place, and to rebuke the racial hatred of those who resist this displacement. His patriotism and worldwide brotherhood cost him and his family nothing, and indeed they add to his profits and leisure." To paraphrase, what Professor Commons is arguing here is that people of means had the incentive to welcome immigrants, to open the door to immigrants, because they could employ and exploit them. People of means could open the door, encourage the opening of the door, because they could welcome them into their flock, whether it's in their church or in their factory. Because these people, the people of means, don't have to compete with the average immigrant. Yeah. So there's no cost to people of means to opening the door to immigrants. It'll make their lives even better. But the contrast to this, Commons argues, is that the average American and the lower middle class American, they stand a lot to lose from having to compete with, other people coming to America. And of course, in the midst of that sort of economic debate is this racial and ethno-religious debate, right? Should they give way to a Chinaman, a Hindu, or a Turk, to take his place? So this is more than a dog whistle by the otherwise progressive Professor John Commons. But again, in trying to understand why immigrants came because there were laws that encouraged them. Immigrants came because big business supported policies that welcomed immigrants. And immigrants came because there were opportunities in America. You had huge tracts of open land. You had abundant natural resources. You had some of the best soil in the world, virgin soil. And then, of course, as we've discussed in class, you had the Homestead Act of 1862, which gave 160 acres of land to applicants if they were willing to farm that land. Yeah. So immigrants came for the land. Immigrants came because there is something about the American spirit, the spirit of rugged individualism, the spirit of free enterprise, the spirit of we can do it. And a lot of people, despite, maybe, recent trends or our sensibility that all is lost for America, which is not a sensibility I necessarily share. A lot of people come to America because they like the American spirit. They like the "don't tread on me" They like the "we can do it." They like the cheerleading and the patriotism. There's an allure to that, and that lured in a great many immigrants. So there were opportunities, and then there was this perception of opportunity that pulled immigrants to America. And they came into Ellis Island, you know, between 1892 and 1924, 12 million people entered to this building, Ellis Island. Thousands enter daily. About 20% were rejected for one reason or another. So that's usually it was because of disease, but there are complicated stories there. And here are some images of people coming into Ellis Island, wearing their native garb, if you will. Yeah, they withstood a brutal journey. They knew not what to expect when they came. These are brilliant stories, daunting at times, inspirational at other times, but thrilling more often than not. And I could tell you 100 stories about Ellis Island, but not today. This is Angel Island in the San Francisco Bay. Immigrants at Angel Island had it much more rough than immigrants at Ellis Island. They were questioned as to whether they could actually be American. They were held in detention centers and interrogated and sometimes abused before they were allowed in. And here is a young Asian man, clearly being interrogated by, bureaucrats at Angel Island. Yeah. Now, all of this immigration really challenged this notion of America as a melting pot. Since your attention must be drawn to it all, let's point to it now. This is a political cartoon from Puck magazine, and it is Lady Liberty looking disheveled, and she has her spoon of equal rights stirring the cup of citizenship, and jumping out of that is this sort of offensive character of the caricature of an Irish person who's going to come out and try to stab Lady Liberty. There was a question. I should say we should all be offended by that. It's sort of grotesque, but such was the position of some people towards the Irish and some people about whether all immigrants would be able to be citizens with equal rights. Yeah. And some of those, if you look at 21st century America, right, there's this notion, by the 45th administration, for example, that there are certain people who just simply can't become Americans, right? There was a travel ban, an immigration ban, rather, on, people from what one particular president called shithole countries, right? That this notion that they can't be American. Right. If you come from a Muslim majority country, can you enjoy, the blessings of citizenship and equal rights? So there are still in the 21st century many who believe that there are people who can't melt into the melting pot. I should say, I don't mind saying, I'm not one of those people, but there's a lot of them. There's a lot of people who truly believe that some cultures can't be made amenable to whatever it means to be American, and they have a very specific and immutable idea of what being American is. Yeah. But despite all of that ideology, there is this kind of more interesting question about to what extent immigrants could, should, or would give up their native identities to assimilate. Yeah. Again, could, yeah, should, how much should they have to assimilate, and how much realistically would they? And that was a really difficult question. Now, to answer that question, we have to grapple with a really, vexing corollary to that, which is that because of the discrimination that groups like the Irish, groups like the Jewish, groups like the Slavs, because of the types of discrimination that they faced, they had to sort of cloister themselves and, live in like a Japanese ghetto in San Francisco, or live in, you know, a Jewish ghetto in the Bronx. Yeah. Where they could just be safe, safety in numbers. And so thus they were maybe less likely to assimilate because patterns of residential segregation and the culture of violence in America effectively forced them into segregated arrangements where it was that much more difficult for them to assimilate. But all of that being important, and I hope you agree, interesting, one fun fact that people tend to overlook is that 25 or 30% of people who came in the Gilded Age from other countries, they went back to their country of origin. They never wanted to be American. They never wanted to like live in America forever. They wanted to escape religious persecution. They wanted to escape ideological persecution. They wanted to put food in their stomachs, whether it was potatoes or rice. And they just wanted to go back. And I say that to say this, recording here in Germany, there are a lot of refugees that have been welcomed by the German government who only want to stay here so long as they need to. They want to be with their children or their grandparents or their neighbors. They don't want to live here forever. They don't like the winters. Yeah, they don't like the food. They don't like the way people look at them in the streets because of the color of their skin or the way they dress. So they want to go back. What percentage? I don't know. There's interesting data on it. There's no consensus on that data. But I'm not here to talk about 21st century Germany or 21st century America for that matter. But I do want to point out that a lot of people who came to America during the Gilded Age had no intentions of staying. Yeah. So we have like a whole host of reactions to this flood of immigrants. You have nativists, and nativism is rising in America again. And they thought that Southern and Eastern Europeans could never assimilate. Yeah, that they were, too susceptible or too indoctrinated with Catholicism or socialism or anarchism, and they were always going to be a threat. The nativists were particularly alarmed at the birth rates of the Catholics. They thought that the Catholics were going to take over. Again, I don't want to talk about the modern era too much, but it's just like the way a lot of Europeans talk about Muslim immigrants coming to our shores. Well, if you game it out over the course of decades, the Muslim communities are going to have, 4 kids per family. And then, the Germans are going to have 1.8 kids per family. And next thing you know, we're all going to have to learn to speak Arabic. I have to say, though there's an illusion of logic to that, I have no patience for these arguments, but maybe you do. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I usually am. But the nativists blamed immigrants for these shameful cities and their willingness to work for whatever money they could get. Yeah, and the nativists were particularly scared that like the Irish would intermarry with the Protestants. The Catholics would intermarry with the Protestants, or even worse, the Chinese would intermarry. Chinese men are going to come for your white daughters. The worst possible thing is the nation becomes this mongrelized nation, right? Of half Chinese, half Irish people, and they're going to take over. And so this was one reaction to immigration, which is nativism. A second was the American Protective Association, which was defiantly and openly anti-Catholic. Yeah, there was a real perceived urgency to get the Catholics out of politics. That's another reaction to immigration. A third was organized labor. Yeah, the unions, the American Federation of Labor, the Congress of Industrial Organization, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, they were all anti-immigrant because the immigrants were used as strike breakers. Yeah. And if industry was able to enjoy the protection of foreign goods through tariffs, then laborers should be entitled to protection from foreign laborers by immigration policies that stop the flow of immigrants. Here is an image of Uncle Sam, uh, saying, "Hey, stop right there. You're not coming into America because you're a Jew." Yeah. You have one sack of poverty, one sack of disease, and on your back you have Sabbath desecration and anarchy. You could never be American. Scram. Here is a famous Thomas Nast cartoon from 1867. Yeah. Uh, and it's to show what's going to happen on St. Patrick's Day, where these Irish who look at them, the caricature of them is like they're like subhumans and they're beating the police. Blue lives matter, right? And these Irish sort of like animals are beating on the cops, and the cops are just trying to, protect good, decent Americans from these, drunk, angry Irish monkeys. I need to impress upon you the degree to which anti-Catholic, anti-Irish sentiment was the predominant sentiment in white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. Irish were not seen as white. I know y'all see them as about as white as they can be, but the Irish were seen as a different race of people. They weren't WASPs. They weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were different and lesser in the eyes of way too many white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Yeah. And so you have the churches, Protestant churches, led by people like Josiah Strong, which in his book, Our Country, Its Possible Futures and Its Present Crisis from 1885, writes this screed about how immigrants are destroying American cities, that they're making cities into dens of sin, gambling, and robbery, and prostitution, and corruption, and that there needs to be a movement, right? Which we'll talk about later, the social gospel movement, to combat against the 7 perils facing the nation: Catholicism, Mormonism, socialism, intemperance, just drinking, just a shot at the Irish, wealth, urbanization, and immigration. Now, though there was a diversity in approaches among Protestant churches, which we'll talk about, this was, I'm going to say, the dominant strand of immigrant attitude among most Protestant sects. They were anti-immigrant because they were anti-Catholic, they were anti-Slav, they were anti-Chinese, they were anti-Japanese, because these people weren't going to be part of the flock. So you have massive anti-Chinese sentiment, which intensified after the Panic of '73. This was manifested most notably in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which did exactly what it claims to do in the title. This Chinese Exclusion Act, excluding Chinese people from America, was extended for another 10 years in 1892. In 1902, it was extended indefinitely, and it was only repealed when, in 1943, the Chinese allied with the United States to defeat Japan. And here is a caricature of the bloodthirsty, rapacious Chinese. This is what he's going to do to our women. Here's Lady Liberty asking about the Chinese question. You know what this Chinese guy is? He's an American. He's an American. And all those people are at the gates, the tree behind them, where the coloreds, quote unquote coloreds, were hanging from the trees. And that's what they want to do to the Chinese men. Here's another Nast cartoon, the great fear of the period, right? Uncle Sam is going to be swallowed by the Chinese, the Irish, and then one's going to swallow the other, leading to some sort of mongrelized Chinese. It's a really mongrelized Chinese, Irish mix. This is the fear of nativists and social gospelers Yeah. You have this massive anti-Japanese sentiment in 1907. A gentleman's agreement was signed between Teddy Roosevelt and the embassy of Japan to um, stop Japanese from coming. The governments agreed to stop the trade of people, if you will, um, and yeah, it's just Japanese people were seen to be uh, lesser, racially lesser, despite having been, one of the more modern industrial constitutional countries in East Asia. But this was all wrapped up in problems around residential segregation and education in San Francisco, which maybe we could get into another time. I'm reaching my time limit here. I know. In 1897, Congress passed a literacy test for immigrants, which would refuse entry to anyone who couldn't read 40 words in any language, including their own. This literacy test was vetoed by Cleveland. Taft vetoed a similar literacy test bill. And then Woodrow Wilson, during World War II, also vetoed the literacy test, but his veto was overridden. So a literacy test existed for a couple of years. And then that was overridden by the 1921 and 1924 immigration quota laws, which basically reduced immigration from people who weren't from Northwestern Europe. And this was the defining immigration legislation for, 40 years in the 20th century. And what these laws did, what the 24 Immigration Quota Act did, is it said that 2% of the number of immigrants who came to America in 1870, or maybe it was 1890, could come per year after 1924, which is to say 2% of, if you're the case of China, 2% of nothing, because there were very few Chinese in America in 1870. Yeah. 2% of, Russians or other Eastern Europeans, 2% of Turks. Yeah. Very little room for them in America after 1924. So one of the reactions to massive immigration was legislation to stop immigration. And I just want to conclude here with sort of an update of immigration to America. On the left, you have legal immigration to the US, which, as we know, doesn't speak to all immigrants. Legal immigrants to the US by decade from 1960 to 2009. And what we see here is that you have more and more Latin American immigration, more and more Asian immigration, less and less European and Canadian immigration. In the 1960s, about half of immigrants were coming from Europe. And these days, that's down to about 15%. Yeah, so the composition of the US continues to change, as evidenced by this table on the right, or this bar graph on the right. This is the US population by race and ethnic group in 1970, 40 years later in 2010, and projected 40 years later in 2050. And we see that America is becoming a so-called majority minority country, which is another way of saying that America is becoming more diverse. And there are those of us who see this as a source of strength and opportunity. And there are those of us, and there are others, I'll say, who see this as a threat to the American way. Yeah. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps the American way is threatened, but the American way needs to continue to change, as the American way has always changed, right? Let us not forget that it was the Irish who were the great threat for most of the 19th century, and the Irish seem to have assimilated pretty darn well. It was the Italians who were the great threat. The Italian Roman Catholics, they could never be loyal to America. They're always going to be loyal to the Pope. And now we glorify the Irish. We glorify the Italians. They're so much a part of the American cultural fabric. And the same can be true of people from Muslim backgrounds, people from Asian backgrounds, people from Latin American backgrounds, but only if we know our history. And of course, that's what we're trying to do here. And with that, we will pause and we will return to talk about some other challenges in immigration, industrialization, and urbanization. Thanks. I'll see you soon.